Okay, well, thank you everybody very much for joining us here tonight. I'm delighted to be part of the programming accompanying Noah Satterstrom's remarkable show. I hope that you've all had a chance to see the mural already and maybe even sit down and do a little bit of weaving with Emily Wiki, also a very exciting part of the show. Noah's journey to discover the fate of Dr. Smith began long before I was involved in the Asylum Hill Project. But as I've learned more and more about his process and how he came to create this monumental work, I've really felt that there are parallels in the work that he does as an artist and that I do as an archaeologist, at least where this particular project is concerned. We're both trying very hard, though his exploration is much more personal, trying to humanize the individuals and the individual stories of the people that were at the asylum, and to help gallery visitors understand that everyone who ended life at the asylum had a whole life before they were institutionalized, and they had a life at the asylum as well, and that there were very many different pathways to institutionalization. So Noah's work shows the life of Dr. Smith in really rich detail, harvested from family lore and photographs and correspondence and all these great archival documents found through really dedicated research. And through Noah's eyes, you can see the descent into severe mental illness, an ordeal not dissimilar to that experienced by the artist himself. And likely by many museum visitors, either of them with their own struggles or having seen family and friends go through similar things. So he's got this very vivid picture. In archaeology, we rarely have the luxury of discovering such intimate details as Noah was able to find through his research. We get small clues, rather, little things we pick up from artifacts or from the bones, and just tantalizing little things that we can weave together to make short narratives. The title of my talk, so I use the word biographies, but that's a little bit of an exaggeration. If you're coming here tonight hoping to hear the whole story about anyone who is buried in the cemetery, I'm afraid you'll be bitterly disappointed. But we are able to get little glimpses or create little vignettes, sometimes just a moment captured in time by an artifact that was left behind. But like Noah, I'm hoping that I can show you the human side of the asylum, and I'm hoping that the glimpses will sort of resonate and allow visitors like you to bridge the experiences of the patients from long ago and the experiences of people with mental illness and disability today. The whole time I've been talking, I've sort of been ignoring this slide that I put up here, just so it wouldn't be boring. This is a photo of Noah visiting our site along with Megan Hines in March of 2023. And our conversation during his visit to Jackson actually led to him adding to his mural, but I'm going to leave that to the end, since that's the exciting part. First, I want to give some background for those of you who are not that familiar with our project. But first, real quick, how many of you have heard a good amount before about the Asylum Hill Project? Okay, so most people are somewhat familiar. But I'll give you the whole thing briefly. So the Mississippi State Asylum, originally the Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum, occupied land just north of Jackson from 1855 to 1935, which means it took in patients before, during, and after the Civil War, and all the way up to halfway through the Great Depression, including the Great Flood of the Mississippi Delta in 1927. Research is ongoing, but the institutional reports indicate that somewhere around 30,000 patients were admitted during this 80 years, and of those, almost 10,000 died as patients, which sounds like a disturbingly high death rate. But bear in mind that many people came to the institution already gravely ill with physiological diseases that have psychiatric symptoms, such as pellagra was a disease of nutritional deficiency, a niacin deficiency that leads to dementia shortly before it leads to death. Tertiary syphilis, making a comeback in Jackson, can also lead to dementia. Also, other people were admitted with disabilities that at the time there was no way to treat without modern medical treatment, and so those individuals were institutionalized for life, like people with epilepsy. Also, patients were admitted that were already sick with tuberculosis, which was, of course, the #1 fatal disease at the time. And a large number, of course, came to the institution with senile dementia. So however long they lived out the rest of their lives because there was nowhere else for them to go. So all these factors together explain the seemingly very high death rate. There's seating up front if y'all would rather. Okay. So this slide shows the asylum around 1940, about 5 years after the institution closed. And you can see what was left of the buildings here. And then over here, this strange shape is our cemetery. You can see there is a tree line, probably there was a fence line. It's kind of distinct from the agricultural and pasture fields around it. And here it is up closer with some purple around it, just so you can see it better. Now, unfortunately, the graves in the cemetery are currently unmarked. We don't have complete death and burial records. A pathway for accessing the patient records for limited research has recently been created by state law, but there hasn't been time for real investigation to be done yet. What we do know, though, is that the asylum administration was actually in contact with the patient families much more than you would expect. And they're exchanging information, and they definitely were informing families when death was imminent and when death had occurred. So many patients' bodies were claimed by their families for burial. But others died with no family outside the asylum anymore, or a family that couldn't afford to claim the bodies, or were too far away to make it in time, or who simply couldn't even be reached with limited communication before the body needed to be buried, which was in about 24 hours at the time. So the patients who weren't claimed were interred in the burial grounds at the asylum. Official death records weren't kept in Mississippi until 1912, but from 1912 to 1935, so about 23 years, we know that over 4,300 patients were buried in this cemetery. And of those, almost 85% were African American. Now, we don't know how many patients were buried in the 57 years prior to these death records. And this is 12 acres, this property. It's a large piece of property. We don't have any plat maps, and the grave markers that were originally used deteriorated a long time ago. The few stone markers that were provided by families got vandalized, knocked down, and eventually removed from the site. But we do have some clue about how many people are here. Remote sensing was done, including ground penetrating radar and magnetic radiometry. And based on those results, somewhere between 4,000 and 7,000 people are buried on this property, which is quite a lot. So here you can see the outline of the old asylum buildings and the cemetery boundary superimposed on the modern aerial. And I show you this so you can see that the cemetery location is the last undeveloped land on the campus of the University of Mississippi Medical Center, and that land is going to be needed for expansion in the future. And this expansion is vital for maintaining the health of the people of Mississippi. Because not only is UMMC the only medical school and the only dental school in the state, it is the only hospital with a level 1 trauma center. It's the only level 1 NICU. It houses the only dedicated children's hospital in the state, as well as being the state burn unit. It's the only place you can get organ transplant surgery. It's the only hospital in Jackson, as I understand, that accepts non-insured patients for non-emergent care. The med students run the only free clinic in the city, the capital city. And all of this is in a state with the lowest life expectancy in the country. So you can see why it is important for UMC to continue to grow and expand to serve the people of Mississippi. Thus, the decision to move this many deceased people was not made lightly, but the administration weighed the needs of the living against the needs and respect for the dead and decided that If performed respectfully, excavation would be the best path forward that would allow UMMC to stay centralized and save taxpayers money, because buying this much land elsewhere would cost a lot. So the Asylum Hill Project was established to study and research the history of the institution and then respectfully remove and memorialize the dead. And all of this work is done in consultation with a group of direct descendants. We have about 150 who have come forward and are working with us, as well as the descendant communities. And out of respect for them, I should mention, though I do have images of burials in my slideshow, the human remains are censored out. We do that because we're just a few generations removed from living descendants here. All right, so previous work exhumed about 112 individuals in 2 campaigns, first in 1992 and then in 2013. The current excavation began in November of 2022, and we have removed just over 410 burials as of today. 414, right? Yes, 414. I should mention that our excavation crew is here. Up here in the north, where we've concentrated our work, those graves date to between 1900 and 1935, and then the smaller block where we did our field school last summer, that dates to the late 19th century. And we do this rough dating based on the nails that were used to construct the coffins. So, despite the fact that these graves are relatively recent, I mean, the oldest is 169 years, most recent 89 years old, bone preservation is generally quite poor. Oh, I'm losing it. I think my ear is bigger than they planned. Sorry. Bone preservation is generally quite poor. This is due to the nature of the poorly drained, expansive clay soils, which anyone who owns a house in Jackson knows all about the clay soils. But just along this ridge top, which is demarcated in yellow on this topographic map, we do have some better preservation because the soil is a little sandier. But because of this poor preservation, we realized early on that we weren't going to be able to tell everyone's story based on what we could learn from the bones and the osteological analysis. And that we weren't really expecting to find a lot of artifacts to help flesh out the stories because these are institutional burials. But we have been pleasantly surprised. Now, when I say that we weren't expecting a lot of artifacts in institutional burials, that's because interment in graveyards at asylums, hospitals, prisons, poor farms, any place where you're being buried at the expense of the state, burial tends to be pretty uniform and no frills. In the United States, there's generally an effort to provide what's considered decent Christian burial. Everyone is dressed or shrouded, put into a coffin. The coffin goes into an individual grave rather than a mass grave. There's usually some type of limited funeral, like religious funeral rites. So far, we haven't found any documentation or archaeological evidence of what kind of funerals they were performing. Excuse me. But for the most part, we have found institutional burial practices. Almost everyone is buried in the exact same type of coffin, which you can see here. Most years, these coffins were being made in the asylum carpentry shop. They're all the same. They're about 6.5 feet long. They're 18 inches wide at the shoulder. They're made with 3/4 inch boards. And they're consistent in size regardless of the size of the individual. This child was buried in the same size coffin as the guy who was almost 6 feet tall. And in most of the graves in the 20th century part of the cemetery, we don't really find a lot of buttons or clothing artifacts. It appears that we mostly find pins. Like you can see a straight pin over here and a safety pin on the other side. It appears that they were being buried in some kind of simple like gown or shroud and then wrapped in a winding sheet, which is probably what was pinned. We know that they were making these burial sheets in the asylum sewing department. And you usually find about 3 or 4 pins. But even in something simple like pins, there can be variation that tells a story. In this case, it's not a story about the deceased, but about somebody else. So this individual in the center, the person in burial 269, you see all those red arrows? Those are all pointed to 18 pins that were found with this individual. And it's not the only one. There are actually 10 different graves with 10 or more pins, all in the same area of the cemetery. You can see here the ones with the blue outline. There are 5 in a row. So in this, I see the hand of a particular individual with these overkill pinnings. I can imagine a nurse or another staff member or even a patient helper who just did this task with a peculiar finickiness and didn't prepare the dead very often because it's just in this area, or someone came along and told that person, hey, quit wasting so many pins. And the behavior stopped. But it's nice, even in the tiniest, most mundane objects, you can sometimes get little glimpses of past behavior. So now, though, I'll turn to stories of the patients. One of the first objects that really intrigued the crew was this thick 18-karat gold wedding band that's inscribed with the words, "Ever true to thee." The ring is a modern size 6.5. It weighs a whopping 12 grams, which is 0.385 troy ounces, which is quite a lot of gold, actually. The width of the band suggests that the ring belonged to a male, but there were very few bone fragments in this grave, so we really couldn't tell age or sex. Gold dental fillings were also found in this grave, and between the fillings and the pretty nice ring, it's a good bet that this individual was financially well off before institutionalization. And yet, the person was buried in one of the plain asylum-made coffins, just like everyone else around. So by the time of death, either no relative remained outside the asylum with the means or the inclination to provide for funeral expenses, or no one could be contacted before burial became necessary in that 24-hour period, like I was talking about. But either way, this person went to the grave with a symbol of what seems to have been a loving marriage, which tells us something about him. But it also tells us something about the asylum workers, because it's very easy to fall into the stereotypes. All of the asylum staff were evil people that abused the patients and would have stolen anything of value. Obviously, from this ring, that was not the case. Meanwhile, solid gold is stamped on the inside of this ring from burial 396. Evidence of a deception from over a century ago, because this is clearly not a gold ring. Oddly enough, it wasn't green corroded like all the brass and other copper alloy rings that we find in the cemetery. We do find quite a few. The second ring, with the blue glass gem, was also found on a finger on the left hand in an arrangement suggesting an engagement ring or wedding band. And then this small earring sort of rounded out the jewelry ensemble. The natural teeth of this person had this arrangement of fillings, and when the teeth had to be replaced with dentures, they copied the arrangement so that it kept the original appearance of the person. And between the jewelry and the dentures and the fillings, I get the sense that this person took particular pride in her appearance. And their presence in the grave indicates that whoever prepared her body for burial, whether it was staff, fellow patients, they honored this particular personality trait when they laid her to rest. And aside, I was so fascinated by the aluminum ring, I looked it up, and maybe some of you knew that aluminum spent a period of time being a rare and precious metal. You didn't learn to process it until 1845, so between 1850 and 1880, it was more valuable than gold, and people made jewelry out of aluminum in its own right. But by the 1890s, with the advent of electricity, it became cheap to manufacture, it fell out of fashion, and obviously this ring, since it was pretending to be something else, is from a period after aluminum became cheap. So almost no human remains at all were present in burial 320. But as you can see here, we found 24 buttons. There were 6 white crosser buttons, also called China buttons sometimes, running down the midline that were probably from camisole or some other similar undergarment. And then there were 15 composite metal buttons. They're japanned metal base and shank, and then a little copper face with a, seems to be a felt insert. And there are also 2 of the same buttons found at the location of each sleeve. So I consulted with Lori Neufeld, who is a costume historian at Mississippi State, and she told me that dress bodices from the 1870s and 1880s tended to have 15 or more buttons down the front like this. But bear in mind that the date of the dress has nothing to do with the date of burial, because a patient might be admitted and live at the asylum for only a few days, or might live there for a few decades before being buried in the clothing that was inventoried and packed away when she arrived at the asylum. So all we can say is that this person owned a dress from this time period. Another clue to this woman's life, though, is found, I have a pointer, why am I pointing with my finger? Right here, this black ring is a vulcanized rubber mourning ring, and it would be a symbol of a loved one who was lost, probably before she entered the institution. You might see there's a theme here with the rings, a lot of rings. We have actually found quite a few rings. It's the most commonly found personal object in the cemetery. You also might be wondering why I'm showing you a dress with buttons when I just got through saying most people weren't buried in clothing. So the people who were buried in shrouds and pins, that's primarily in the 20th century part of the cemetery that we're excavating in the north. This individual was found in that smaller block that dates to the late 19th century. And in that smaller block, most people had buttons. A lot of people had very plain buttons that matched, which seems to have been maybe institution-issued clothing at the time. And then there's also a variety of buttons from people being buried in their own personal clothes. And I'm not sure what institutional policy changed between those 2 time periods, but we may discover something in the asylum records. So once again, age and sex could not be determined from the highly fragmented remains in burial 157. But this single unusual artifact might give us insight not only into the person buried in the grave, but also the operation of the asylum cemetery. In case you can't tell what it is, because how could you? It's a 15-inch long piece of tile that's about that thick. And we know where the tile probably came from. It was probably salvaged from a remodel of the asylum that's mentioned in this 1923 superintendent's report, where they say that a new tile was installed throughout. So I had a thought about this tile, and I consulted with Elizabeth West. Anyone here who was here for the opening day may have heard Elizabeth West speak. She is a professor of English and Africana Studies at Georgia State, as well as a direct descendant of a person buried in the cemetery. And Dr. West believes that this offering was likely an adaptive expression of the African-American mortuary tradition of placing ceramic or glass domestic items in or on top of the coffin, or sometimes on top of the grave. And the nature of this particular offering, being that it's a broken, discarded tile instead of a plate and a cup, indicates that African-American patients may have been involved in the burial of the dead at the asylum, because patients wouldn't have been able to procure the kinds of materials you would normally put in place with the dead. A patient couldn't go to the cafeteria and say, hey, give me a cup and saucer, I want to bury it with my friend. So instead, this was a make-do solution, working with what they could obtain. And this make-do solution may explain items found in 4 other graves, another piece of tile, a broken crockery vessel, and a large can. The presumption, though, that the individual interred in this grave was also African American seems like maybe is not the case. The teeth were very well preserved from this grave, though the bones were not. And we used 2 different methods of assessment. Dental morphology looks at very tiny, genetically controlled variations in tooth form and compares that at the population level. And then dental metrics looks at the relative sizes of the teeth in relation to one another and compares those with groups of various ancestry. And using both of those methods, this person was found to be pretty strongly European. So, interesting finding, but then again, you have to understand there are always difficulties when trying to determine someone's socially assigned race from biological markers of ancestry. It can be a little bit difficult, and Dr. West and I discussed some possibilities. One, of course, is that a mixed-race individual who was considered socially to be black might in fact primarily have European heritage that's coming out of the teeth. Or alternately, an African American patient may have made a close friend who happened to be European, and at the time of that person's death, gave the person the same mortuary treatment that he would give to his own kin. So these are both possibilities. We are trying to get a DNA pilot study started, and if we get some good results, maybe we'll be able to add a little more to this story. There is a little bit of documentary evidence supporting the assumption that African American patients were helping with the burial. This note from the institutional records from 1931 states that the deceased was given to Mr. Turner for burial. The 1930 census pages for the asylum showed 8 men with the last name Turner who are all patients, and there are no employees listed with the last name Turner. And 2 of the patients who were Mr. Turner had job assignments that could likely have to do with burial. One was in the carpentry shop, and the other one worked on the asylum grounds. And they were both African American. So this person, hey look, we finally have human remains that are well preserved. This 5'8" tall woman, who was an older woman, in burial 287 was among the better preserved individuals that we've had at the site so far. Unfortunately though, her facial skeleton was too incomplete to try to do ancestral analysis, and she has no teeth. She lost all of her teeth during life and also had the lower left leg amputated. And we found several individuals in the cemetery with dentures. This person was buried without them. And there could be several explanations. She might have lost all of her teeth after institutionalization, because it doesn't seem like people were given dentures at the institution. She might have not been able to afford dentures prior to institutionalization. It might have been a matter of personal preference. I know people without teeth who don't wear dentures. And it could also point to an accidental omission at the time of burial, because we know that that happens as well. But in any case, she is buried in not an asylum-made coffin, but a manufactured coffin. We could tell from the coffin nails, because they're wire nails instead of the machine-cut nails that were used in the 19th century, that this is 20th century. Also, the decorative handle that you see up here is made of stamped sheet steel instead of the white metal that was used for coffin handles in the 19th century. And then we've got this white metal thumb screw that was used to fasten the coffin lid. That exact design of thumb screw was also found at the, the New Salem Cemetery. Does anyone know about the excavation at the Continental Tire plant in Clinton? Okay, so there was one of those found there as well, and it was also found at the Cedar Hill Cemetery in Arkansas in a grave that was dated between 1903 and 1927. So we have a somewhat narrower date range for this burial. So far we've only found 11 of these manufactured coffins out of 414 graves that we've excavated. So it's less than 3%. It means that either she had family that was willing and able to provide this coffin, or that she had burial insurance, because we know several people had burial insurance to cover these expenses. But in any case, given her tall stature, her lack of teeth, her amputation, and the provision of a manufactured coffin, I feel very strongly that when we're able to go through the patient records, she's going to stand out. I think she's really going to stand out for us, assuming that her particular patient record has survived. So, the individual in burial 144, also the bone preservation wasn't great, so we have a drawing. The drawing, done by Emily Wiki, you can actually see that there are individual bones, which you can't really see in the photograph. This is an adolescent, and whereas it might look like there's something missing, this individual was buried with his or her knees on the chest. Even though it's in the same size coffin as everyone else, and it's only taking up about a third of the length of that coffin. We could tell from the development of the third molars, your wisdom teeth, that this person was between 17 and a half and 19 and a half years old at the time of death. Now, the most likely explanation for this unusual burial position would be a contracture deformity. That is a shortening of the muscles and a loss of elasticity, so the legs couldn't be straightened for standard burial. There are two large safety pins, sort of at the lower margin of the body, which either were from wrapping the winding sheet in an unconventional way or potentially from a diaper-like garment. Cerebral palsy and paralytic poliomyelitis are the two most likely explanations for this person's burial position. Both would explain the contracture deformity and also possible scoliosis, which is kind of hard to tell, but the left ribs have collapsed in a way that's very orderly, whereas the right ribs have turned outward, and that could possibly be due to scoliosis. If the individual had poliomyelitis, then likely he or she wouldn't have been institutionalized until paralysis set in. But an individual with severe cerebral palsy may have been institutionalized as early as infancy and would have lived his or her entire life in the asylum. So in burial 302, again, highly fragmented, incomplete human remains, again an adolescent. Despite the poor condition, you could tell from the teeth and some parts of the bones that were still in the process of growing at the time of death, we could tell that this individual was between 13 and 15 and a half years old. But because of this individual's youth and good dental health, we had a full set of teeth available for dental morphological analysis to evaluate ancestry. And we were surprised to find that this individual appears to have been of mixed Native American and African American ancestry. The most obvious trait of Native American ancestry was what's called incisor shoveling, which is, say, there are ridges on the margin of the tooth on the tongue side. And then the most obvious trait of African American is molar crenellation, which is just a little extra ridging on molars. So the teeth of this individual actually told us more than just ancestry. There's something called enamel defects. These are little lines, or in this case lines, sometimes pits, that appear on the teeth because something has happened to the person's health while the teeth were still growing, and it interrupts while the body allocates energy to more important things, and it's working not as hard on forming the teeth. There are 13 teeth that this individual had that had these enamel defects, and we can measure from the tooth root to the defect and get a range of ages from when that health issue happened. So for this person, we know that there was either a severe illness or a period of undernutrition between the ages of 2.5 and 4, and then again between the ages of 5 and 5.5. Now the reason for institutionalization of a person this young can only be guessed at. But epilepsy was a really common cause of admittance for younger people, and it was actually listed as cause of death for over 20% of the 176 adolescents that appear in those post-1912 death certificates. So it is a potential cause of this person's commitment, though it could just as easily have been a true mental illness. And then one more little thing to add to the story. On the individual's left hand, there was a plain copper alloy band, which could be an inexpensive wedding ring. And at this young age, that just adds another interesting layer. And this brings us back to the child that I showed you earlier when I was talking about consistency and coffin size. This 8.5 to 9.5-year-old in burial 138 is just one of 3 children that we found so far. We're not counting adolescents as children. People 13 to 19 are in their own category. Children are newborn to 12 years old. And we're able to estimate the age based on the dental remains, because we could see how much the teeth had developed. But other than that, as you can see, there wasn't much to go on for this person. All we know is that because of which part of the cemetery we found the grave in between 1900 and 1935, because of the coffin nails. Between 1912 and 1935, just 30 children are listed in those official state death certificates of individuals being buried at the Asylum Cemetery. And just 4 of those, 2 girls and 2 boys, are in the 8 to 9 years old range. So I can't tell you this child's story yet. But we're getting potentially close. If we could find a few more clues that would narrow down the date range for this part of the cemetery, if I could say with certainty that this grave post-dated 1912, so this person potentially in the death records, then I could feel confident that this is one of the 4 children named in those death certificates. And if a DNA study is successful, then we would, at a minimum, be able to tell the sex and ancestry of this child, which would potentially narrow the identification down to 2. And that's amazing, considering this is a burial population of up to 7,000 people. So, more on that to come. But whereas I'm constrained in my storytelling by what I can at least partly prove or deduce with logic, Noah produces his narratives that evoke feeling, not facts. Towards the end of his painting, he included the Asylum Cemetery. And you can see the grounds when it was an active cemetery. You can see the grave diggers at work, and you can see what I've interpreted, without talking to him actually, as individuals freed and ascending. And then over there, you can see he included us. There's a small window into the ground and into the future showing an archaeologist. So Noah came to visit the site not long after we discovered that child's grave. And so it was one of the discoveries that I talked about a lot while he was visiting. And he was so intrigued by the thought, since he wasn't aware that there were children at the asylum, that he went home and added this little girl to an already completed panel. And what's amazing about this is that more people will see the little girl in this painting than will ever hear me talk about the dead in the asylum or ever read any publication that comes out of this project. Art has the potential to reach so much of a wider audience than anything that we do as archaeologists. And so he's able to tell her story when I'm still not. Which is wonderful because Noah has the same goal, to resurrect those who have been forgotten.
But you have to do that.
I did a little bit. I hope it does turn out to be a girl, or else I'll have to change the painting. So as our excavation progresses, despite our poor bone preservation and sometimes the paucity of artifacts, we're going to continue to try to build narratives out of the small clues that we can find. And I hope that these are going to resonate with the public. Our collaboration with NOAA and the Museum of Art is wonderful. It's a wonderful way to spread word about our project. You know, his art has gotten national coverage, and I'm hoping that coverage may help lead some descendants to seek us out and tell us their family stories, because descendants are scattered across the country now, and many of them are probably unaware of what's going on in Jackson, Mississippi. But the outreach through Noah's and Emily's art is much more important than just for the practical issue of helping us gather more voices for our descendant-guided research. We're really hoping that viewing Noah's mural and experiencing his great-grandfather's story, or sitting with Emily and doing some weaving and contemplating the lives of the patients, or even just hearing me talk about archaeology and sort of envisioning the little glimpses that we can get of the dead. We hope that this is going to encourage people to think about mental illness, not just the patients in the past, but in the way that people are treated today. This patient population wasn't a monolithic group of faceless people. They all had their own stories. They all had lives before they came to the institution. They had a bunch of different ways that they arrived there. And the hardest part to envision, really, is that they also had lives in the institution. Life doesn't end with institutionalization. People continued to interact with one another. They sometimes formed friendships. They learned new things, like how to weave. They experienced joys, I hope, as well as sorrows. They still had lives, just like people with mental illness continue to now. And I will now take questions. Yes, sir.
Is there a timeline for this immense project?
Well, originally, it was estimated the excavation would take 6 to 7 years. But we have excavated 400 in 1.5 years, so do the math. We're hoping to increase our crew size soon, and hopefully excavation will be completed in less than 10 years from our beginning. The actual analysis phase could take as many, I don't know, as 20 or 30 years for fully investigating and trying our best to identify every single set of human remains that comes out of the cemetery. Yes, sir.
So you're trying to get DNA data, right? And what's the problem? The problem right now is degradation. How do you solve that problem?
We don't. Well, what we originally started with was a pilot study, just 4 samples using standard forensic techniques. That got nothing.
Looking at bones or teeth or both?
Teeth.
Okay.
Then only the best of the best teeth. That was in 2013 or 14 with the originally excavated remains. Last year, we sent another set of teeth for techniques using more ancient DNA techniques that try to create genotype files. So it's not the CODIS markers that are used forensically. It's less specific, but more markers. I'm not good at explaining it because I'm not a DNA scientist. But in any case, that pilot study succeeded in that they found there was genetic material present, but the lab that we used didn't have the capability to take it another step further, which would be necessary to be able to see things like sex and haplotype. So now we're working on starting a pilot study with a third lab that claims that they have all of their own equipment in-house and they can take the analysis that next step further that would be necessary to get something from these badly degraded remains.
Did I hear you correctly that 85% of the population at the asylum was black or African American?
No, 85% of those who were buried in the cemetery between 1912 and 1935. So there was, in different years, there were different proportions of African American and Euro-American patients, and actually if you do some weaving with Emily, the work of her loom is set up to represent those proportions. I can't call any of the numbers to mind myself, but so we've got those, let's say, two groups, and even if they're roughly equal amounts, then the ones that we're dealing with are just the ones who died, and then we're dealing with people whose bodies were not claimed. So at each step, there are different factors that are deciding whether or not a person lived, whether or not a person was claimed by family or ended up buried in the cemetery. Potentially one factor that led to so many African Americans being buried in the cemetery in the later period was the flood in the Delta, because so many families were displaced and cemeteries were underwater, and it's potentially that there was no place to send the body back to. So more people would have ended up being buried at the asylum. Yes, ma'am.
How did you decide where to begin excavating, for the field school or for season one of your work?
And go back. Oh, too far. So we started excavating at the very northern point, and we decided to do that because, as you can see, the northern point of the cemetery is not all the way up to Lakeland. So there's a good chunk of land that we investigated to be sure there were not any graves. We went from the northernmost grave that you can see, we dug back 50 feet to the north to make sure that there weren't any discontinuous graves. We found nothing, the remote sensing found nothing. And so what we were hoping to do was to clear land available for expansion of the hospital as soon as possible, so that they've got all of that frontage on Lakeland where they could start building now while we're still continuing to excavate further south. Now the reason we put the field school where we did, two reasons. I wanted it to be on the ridge top because these kids are paying money to come dig, and we wanted them to have the best chance of decently preserved skeletons so that they can learn. Because if you're paying thousands of dollars, it's not very fair for you to excavate a grave and there's almost nothing there. But the reason I put it in that particular area is you see that there's the narrow part and the wider part of the cemetery. And in between those, the remote sensing found that this is an old road. And actually, if you stand there and you look just right, you can see where the road used to be. So I was curious as to what was going on in these two different parts of the cemetery. And what we found out was that I believe this used to be the northern boundary of the cemetery at one point, because as the graves get closer to it, they got really close together, as if they thought they were running out of room. But then someone came along and said, okay, we can expand the cemetery to the north of the road, since these graves are later than those. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I'm interested in following up on the question about African Americans buried there and the stories that you're understanding about the differences between the ways that African Americans and Caucasians were interred and were treated during those periods. And I'm wondering if there's any kind of collaborations with historians of social practices and understanding about mental health disparities between the treatments of the races in Mississippi especially, and what you're learning about unfolding as you're understanding the ways, the burial practices in relationship to the treatments?
The simple answer is yes, that kind of research is ongoing. I don't do it because I'm an archaeologist.
Right.
I do like reading things, but I'm very busy with the up to 7,000 burials. So the research on the history of the asylum and the medical history is being done. I believe we have someone in the audience that's doing some research. Dr. Gleason has been doing some research into that. And there's a volume supposed to be coming out at some point, correct? Do we have a title for that volume yet?
I can't say it.
Oh, we don't have a title for that. But yes, historians and doctors and psychiatrists are working on that kind of research separately. But really, in my opinion, apart from the institutional records, the patient records themselves are probably going to tell us the most about disparities or differences between care plans for patients. And for a long time, those couldn't be accessed at all because of Mississippi's laws. And now a law was passed that will allow some limited research, but with de-identified, de-identified records. So I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, we're a long way out from really having a good understanding.
It seems like burial practices will be a rich part of that conversation, right?
Yes, I think so. It's still pretty early days yet, a pretty low percentage of the total graves that will eventually excavate. But like you said, we're finding these little glimpses already of differences. Yes, sir.
When you were thinking about either participating or studying archaeology, did you ever think about participating in something like this?
I did not. I would not ever imagine that I would have the opportunity to work on something this massive or this important. I think originally, what did I think I would be doing? I think when I was in college, I thought I'd be working in Mesoamerica. This is way more interesting to me, by the way, than working in Mesoamerica. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just impressed that they're in such straight rows, because the unmarked graves in Greenwood Cemetery are very higgledy-piggledy. Do you have any idea how they marked them carefully?
And actually, if you go to the Whitfield Museum, I don't know if everyone knows that, the institution at Whitfield, there is a museum and there is a partial remnant of one of the original wooden markers on display there that someone stole from the cemetery, but thank goodness he did, or else he would survive, and then turned over to the institution. According to the records that I've read, everyone, their grave was marked with a wooden marker that was painted with the name of the deceased, the date of death, and the county that the person came from. So that information was available. And in the asylum administration communications with the family, they specified this so that, and to let the families know if you wish to come later when you can and lay flowers on the grave, you should be able to find it easily. I would love to think that at one point they had a map, and maybe it's hiding somewhere, but we probably won't get that lucky. But I think between the markers and the fact that certainly during this, the asylum was so big, and the Depression, people were very ill. I think the graves were also pretty fresh when you came to dig the next one, so you could see. And what I was thinking originally, you didn't ask this, but I was thinking originally that maybe people were buried all the way across chronologically, and that would be a way for us to tell if we could identify this person here. Then we just look in the death certificates. Who is the next person to die? The person who died 2 days later should be in the grave next door. But what we found through some variation in the fasteners used to nail the coffin lids together is that actually they were probably buried more like in a block at a time rather than all the way across, because we have a section about like this where this particular kind of coffin lid construction was used. So those all seem to date to the same period. Yes, sir.
The question, it's for you, but it's also for you all working at the site. You know, as you're understanding the kind of circumstances of these people's lives, the history, the kinds of circumstances of the medical treatment of the day, do you feel like how has your relationship to them changed, these individuals? You know, it's kind of an abstract question, but do you imagine a life for them? Do you imagine who they were? Or has that changed as you spent just more and more hours? Because when you spend enough hours at a place, things just start, you know, things get sharper.
I guess I'll answer first. For me, I guess I don't even really see them as the patients that they were at the end of their lives, because the bones tell you the whole story going all the way back. So wherever I excavate graves, whether it's an institutional cemetery or a private family cemetery, I see the whole person, the whole history, the whole life, or I envision. Obviously, I can't see that much. All we have is a few teeth and long bone fragments. But I guess that's what I think of more, and less about how they ended their days necessarily. But that's just me. I'll let someone else answer. Anyone?
Well, I'm much younger in my experience of archaeology compared to Dr. Mack. So I'm still on this journey of getting used to excavating individuals. I have done it before, obviously not in this volume. And I think when we first started this project, we had a ceremony for the individuals, and we each got a name with an age and what their death was. And it just, the more information that's been coming out, the more information that we've been finding, the different medical artifacts, whether that be the the tumors or gallstones, just the medical findings, just every time we find something new, it just builds more and more to this story, and it makes me think a little bit more each time when we excavate another grave of, well, this story was different than that story, and that story was different than that story, and this person doesn't have much left of them, but they were just as much as a person as this person over here that has very, very good preservation comparatively. So it's just, as we've gone on and as we've been here for closing on 2 years now, things have just gotten more complex and more personalized, I feel like. And being on a project that is so large and also is so holistic in the way that it's great getting information from medical records, from people who have been our descendants, and people from every walk of life, has really created a story for each individual that is really touching to try to figure out and to learn more, because you don't always get that opportunity in excavations. Sometimes it's just, especially when you work in cultural resource management, it's just remove, and you don't get to learn, and you don't get to really see these people. And this project, I think, is highlighting the fact that these are people, and we're trying to find them and get them home to their families, and or give them a proper respect, rather than taking them out and forgetting about them.
Anyone else? Okay. Stacia said it all.
I'm sorry, I'm too many words.
That was great. Any other questions?
Thank you for doing this work.
Thank you.